Rose Whitmore inherited a clock shop worth $1,950. Her sister took the house. Her brother took the workshop and the truck and the tools. She got a building the county had flagged for roof repairs and a key that didn't turn smoothly anymore. She went in alone, with a flashlight and a can of machine lubricant she found in her car. What she discovered inside that workbench had been sitting there for 40 years, and not one person in that family had ever been meant to find it but her. At 64, after 3 days of sitting in a lawyer's office on Cumberland Avenue, while her sister read every line of the will out loud and her brother checked his phone, Rose Whitmore walked out with two things: a key on a plain metal ring, and the deed to a clock shop on Main Street that had not opened its doors in 14 months. Patricia got the house on Depot Street. 4 bedrooms, the screened porch their grandfather had built by hand in 1987, the backyard where he had grown tomatoes and kept a small garden of herbs Rose could still name from memory. The appraisal came in at $214,000. Gary got the truck, the woodworking tools in the garage, the savings account. Rose got the key. Whitfield, the estate attorney, slid the deed across the table without looking up. He had a form for her to sign, then another form, then a third. She signed where he pointed. Her hand was steady. She had spent 31 years as a seamstress, the last 19 of them doing alterations in a shop 2 blocks from the hospital, and she had learned that your hands do the work, regardless of what is happening in the rest of you. Patricia said it on the way out of the office. They were in the parking lot, the October air coming in low and cold off the street, and Patricia had her keys already in her hand the way she always did, ready to leave, ready to move, the way she had been ready to move for as long as Rose could remember. Patricia had always been the one who knew what came next. "Grandpa always had a soft spot for you," Patricia said. "I guess that's what this is." She said it without heat. That was the thing. Not angry, not accusing. Just stating it the way you state a fact you have been carrying for a long time and have finally found the right moment to set down somewhere. Rose looked at her. Patricia was 66 years old. She had the same mouth as their mother, the same way of holding her jaw when she had decided something. She had driven their mother to chemotherapy for 11 months and had not once asked Rose to come back and help, not because she did not need it, but because asking would have meant admitting she could not do it alone. Patricia had always believed that doing it alone was the point. Rose did not answer. She put the key in her coat pocket and walked to her car. She did not think about what Patricia had said. Not then. She thought about it later, at the kitchen table, with the key on the wood in front of her, and the light going outside, and the thermos of coffee she had forgotten to drink, sitting on the counter, where she had left it that morning. Soft spot, that was the phrase. As if 41 years of her grandfather's life had been an act of favoritism. As if what he had given her was a preference rather than a decision. She put the key in her pocket and went to bed. She did not know yet how wrong that word was. She would not know for another week. She was not sure what she had expected. Their grandfather, Elwood Whitmore, had run the clock shop for 41 years. He had opened it in 1981 with a hand-painted sign, and a set of watchmaker's tools he had carried home from a shop in Knoxville that was going out of business. He had repaired clocks and watches, and the occasional music box for 4 decades, working 6 days a week until his hands began to shake too badly to hold the small screws. And then he had locked the door and gone to live at Meadowbrook, the care facility on the edge of town, where he had died 11 months later at the age of 89. The shop had been closed ever since. Rose had visited him at Meadowbrook every Sunday for the last 3 years of his life. Patricia had come twice. Gary had come once at Christmas and had spent most of the visit talking about a piece of property he was thinking of buying in Harlan County. Rose had not thought about any of that in the lawyer's office. She had sat in the chair and listened and signed where she was told to sign, and now she was sitting in her car in a parking lot in Corbin, Kentucky, with a key to a building she had not been inside in over a year. She started the car. She did not go to the shop that day. She went home, made a pot of soup she did not finish, and sat at the kitchen table with the key in front of her, until it was dark outside. The metal was ordinary, brass, worn smooth at the edges. Her grandfather's initials were scratched into the side of it, small and uneven, the way a man scratches something into metal, not because he wants it to be decorative, but because he wants to be sure of which key it is. She put it back in her pocket and went to bed. Patricia called the next morning at 7:43 a.m. She did not ask how Rose was. She said she'd been thinking about it, and she wanted Rose to know that she was not going to make anything difficult, but that if Rose decided to sell the shop, she expected to be included in that conversation, given everything she had contributed to their mother's care in the final years. And their grandfathers before that. Rose said, "I'll keep that in mind." She hung up. She poured a cup of coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and looked out at the yard. It was the second week of October. The maple at the back of the lot had gone fully red. Their grandfather had planted it the year Rose was born, a fact he had mentioned to her once, and never again, the way he mentioned most things quietly in passing, as if the information were simply available to whoever happened to be standing nearby. She finished the coffee. She got her coat. She drove to Main Street. The shop was on the east side of Main Street, between a hardware store that had been there since the 1940s and a vacant space that had most recently been a tax preparation office. The sign above the door read Whitmore Clock and Watch Repair in letters that had once been gold and were now the color of old mustard. One of the W's had lost its lower right leg and listed slightly to the right, giving the whole sign the look of something that had been leaning into the wind for a long time and had simply decided to stay that way. Rose stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she went in. She had been in this shop hundreds of times. As a child, she had sat on the stool behind the counter and watched her grandfather work, his magnifying loupe pressed to one eye, his fingers moving over the movement of a watch, with a patience she had never seen in any other person. He did not talk much while he worked. He hummed sometimes, old songs she could never quite identify. The shop smelled of machine oil and cedar, and something she had always thought of simply as time, though she understood now that what she had been smelling was the slow accumulation of dust and metal, and the particular stillness of a room full of things whose entire purpose was to measure what was passing. She put the key in the lock. It turned on the first try. The door swung inward. The smell hit her before anything else. Cedar, machine oil, dust. And underneath all of it, faint and familiar, the same talc her grandfather had used every morning, for as long as she could remember, as if the walls had absorbed 40 years of him and were not yet ready to let it go. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went inside. The clocks were still running. That was the first thing she understood. Standing in the dim light with the door open behind her, and the October air coming in at her back. Every clock on the wall, and there were dozens of them, grandfather clocks and mantel clocks and wall clocks and small battery-operated clocks her grandfather had accepted as trade-ins and never gotten around to returning. Every one of them was running, ticking, some in sync, most not. The sound was not loud. It was layered, overlapping, a texture more than a noise, like standing at the edge of a forest and hearing all of it at once. She had not expected that. Her grandfather had wounded them before he left. Or had someone come in to do it while the estate was being settled? She did not know. She made a note to ask the attorney's office. Then she thought about what it would have cost her grandfather, in the weeks before he went to Meadowbrook, to come down here and wind every clock in the shop. His hands had been shaking badly by then. She had watched him try to button his shirt at the care facility one Sunday, and had looked away so he wouldn't see her looking. She walked behind the counter. His workbench was exactly as he had left it. Tools laid out in the order he had always kept them, smallest to largest, left to right, each one in its own place on the leather roll he had owned since before her mother was born. A loop, a set of tweezers in 4 sizes, 3 screwdrivers with handles worn smooth, a can of machine oil, the lid set on top but not pressed down. She did not touch any of it. She spent the first hour walking through the shop, making a list of what needed to be done. The front window had a crack in the lower left corner, fine as a hair but there. The floor needed sweeping, badly. One of the display cases had a hinge that had pulled loose from the wood. The back room had a leak somewhere. There was a water stain on the ceiling above the utility sink, new enough that the edges were still soft. The bathroom light was out. The register was an older model, the kind that printed receipts on a paper roll, and when she opened the drawer she found $47 and some change. The way her grandfather had always left it at the end of a day, enough to make change for the first customer. She stood there looking at the $47 for a moment. Then she closed the drawer and went to find a broom. She had the front half of the shop swept by 10:31 a.m. when the bell above the door rang and a man came in. He was about 70, heavyset, wearing a canvas jacket the color of dried grass and carrying a paper bag from the hardware store next door. He stopped when he saw her. "Didn't know anyone was in here," he said. "Just started this morning," Rose said. He looked around the shop. He looked at the clocks on the wall. Then he looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "You're Elwood's granddaughter," he said, "the one who used to sit on that stool." "Rose," she said, "Henry Alcott." He shifted the paper bag to his other hand. "I've been bringing a clock in here every year since 1983. A Sessions mantel clock. My wife's mother left it to us." He paused. "I heard Elwood passed." "I'm sorry for that." "Thank you," Rose said. He nodded. He looked at the workbench behind her. "You fixing to sell the place?" he said. "I don't know yet," Rose said. It was the truth. She had not let herself think past today. Today was sweeping. Today was making the list. Henry Alcott set his paper bag down on the counter. "I've got the clock in the car," he said. "If you're not taking work yet, I understand. But the chime's been running about 4 minutes slow since August. And I don't know another soul in this county who'd touch it." Rose looked at the workbench, at the tools laid out in their order. "Bring it in," she said. She was not a clockmaker. She had never pretended to be. But she had watched her grandfather work for the better part of 60 years, and she knew the Sessions movement well enough to know what 4 minutes slow usually meant. And when Henry Alcott came back through the door carrying the mantel clock wrapped in a towel, she set it on the workbench and looked at it for a long moment before she picked up the loop. She found the problem in 20 minutes. A worn click spring, the same issue she had watched her grandfather fix on a clock almost identical to this. One when she was 11 years old. She did not have the right part. She told Henry so. "I can order it," she said. "It'll take a few days." "That's fine," Henry said. He was sitting on the stool behind the counter, the stool she used to sit on as a child, and he did not seem to notice or care that he had simply sat down without being invited. "You going to open back up then?" "I don't know," Rose said again. "Elwood would have wanted you to." She did not respond to that. She wrote down the part number in the notebook her grandfather kept next to the register. The same kind of notebook he had always used. A black composition book with his handwriting on the cover. Whitmore Repairs. The handwriting was shaky, the letters larger than they used to be. But they were there. Henry stayed another hour. He talked about her grandfather, the way people in small towns talk about someone who has been a part of the place long enough to become part of its furniture, not with great ceremony, but with the easy familiarity of someone describing a thing they had always assumed would be there. Elwood had fixed his wife's clock every year, had refused to charge him after her wife died, had said when Henry tried to press money on him that a clock that was keeping good time was payment enough. "He said that?" Rose said. "Every time," Henry said. She thought about that after he left. She stood behind the counter in the quiet of the shop, the clocks ticking all around her, and thought about her grandfather standing in this same spot, saying that. A clock keeping good time is payment enough. I want to stop here for a moment, because what Rose did not know yet, what none of us knew, was that the shop had not been empty all those months. Not really. The clocks had been running. The drawers had been labeled. The $47 had been sitting in the register. Someone had been here, in every way that mattered, the whole time. She would understand that in about 3 days. She did not know what the shop was worth. The attorney's office had put the figure at $1,950, which she understood was the value of the equipment and the lease and the contents, and nothing more. It was not a compliment. It was arithmetic. She went back to work. By 2:14 p.m. she had swept the entire floor, cleared the water damage in the back room, well enough to see that the leak was coming from a joint in the copper pipe above the sink and not from the wall. Roof, and replaced the bathroom bulb from a box of spares her grandfather kept in the cabinet under the sink, organized by wattage, each type in its own labeled section. She found the label maker in the same cabinet. The tape was old. The letters were still sharp. She sat down on the floor of the back room with the label maker in her hands and did not move for a while. Her grandfather had been a man who labeled things. Not because he was anxious, or because he did not trust his own memory, but because he believed that a well-organized thing lasted longer. He had said that to her once. She had been maybe 15. She had asked him why he bothered labeling the drawers when he knew exactly what was in them. He had looked at her over the top of his glasses and said, "I'm not labeling them for me." She had not understood what he meant at the time. She was beginning to understand it now. She locked up at 4:33 p.m. The crack in the window, the hinge on the display case, the parts to order for Henry's clock. A full list, 2 pages in the composition book, her handwriting next to her grandfather's. She sat in the car before she started it. Patricia had called again while Rose was working. She had not answered. There was a voicemail she had not listened to. She looked at the phone on the passenger seat for a moment. Then she put the car in reverse and pulled out onto Main Street. The maple at the back of her yard was darker when she got home. The light was going earlier now. She stood on the back porch for a few minutes before she went inside, looking at the tree her grandfather had planted the year she was born, and thought about a man who plants a tree for someone else to sit under. She had not cried yet. She was not sure when she was going to. What she found next, when she went back to that shop the following morning, wasn't what any of us expected. But looking back now, it was the only thing that made sense. She was back at 7:08 a.m. the next morning. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the sidewalk outside the shop had a thin shine of frost on it that she stepped around carefully on her way to the door. The key turned the same way it had the day before. She had expected it to feel different, somehow. More natural. It felt exactly the same. The clocks were still running. She made a note to figure out which ones were battery-powered, and which ones still needed winding, and how often. She made a second note to call the parts supplier in Louisville about the click spring for Henry's clock. She made a third note to call a plumber about the pipe above the utility sink, and then looked at the note and thought about what a plumber would cost, and made a fourth note that said, "Call Harold Blevins first and ask if he knows anyone reasonable." Harold Blevins was 73 years old and had lived 3 streets over from her grandfather for 40 years. He knew everyone in Corbin who did anything with their hands, and he had the particular gift of being able to tell you which of them were good at it. She called him at 8:09 a.m. He picked up on the second ring, the way men of his generation always picked up, as if letting a phone ring more than twice was a form of rudeness. "Rose Whitmore," he said before she said anything. "I heard you were opening the shop back up." "I'm not sure yet," she said. It was becoming a refrain. "Well, good," he said, as if she had said yes. "What do you need?" She told him about the pipe. He was quiet for a moment, then gave her the name of a man named Curtis Reeve, who had done good work on the radiators at the Methodist Church, and would not overcharge her. He also told her, without being asked, that the hardware store next door had ordered in a supply of clock hands over the summer, because someone had told them a repair shop was going to reopen, and they had wanted to be ready. He did not say who had told them that. She thanked him. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she called Curtis Reeve. He came at 2:47 p.m. and fixed the pipe in 40 minutes, and charged her $60, which she paid from the 47 in the register, and he told her on his way out that Elwood had fixed a mantel clock for his grandmother about 20 years ago, and had refused any payment, and that he considered the $60 a fair exchange. She did not know what to say to that. She said thank you. He waved a hand and left. This kept happening. Over the next 4 days, as Rose worked her way through the list in the composition book, people appeared. Not in large numbers, not all at once, but steadily the way water finds its level. The woman from the framing shop 2 blocks down, who brought a pot of soup and said she had been watching the lights on in the shop and wanted to make sure someone was eating. The retired schoolteacher who came in with a bag of cleaning supplies, because he had heard the shop was getting sorted out, and he had extra. The man from the hardware store next door, whose name was Dale, who came in on the 3rd day and replaced the cracked window glass himself without being asked, and would not take anything for it except a cup of coffee, and while he drank it, told her that Elwood had fixed a clock for his mother every single year for 30 years, and had charged her cost for parts, only never labor, because she was on a fixed income, and he had known her since before Dale was born. Rose listened to all of it. She was building a picture. Not intentionally, not at first. But each of these stories added something to it, the way small tiles add to a mosaic, and by the 4th day she had begun to understand that her grandfather had been living, for 4 decades, inside a web of quiet exchanges that no one had ever tried to quantify or record or put a number to. She thought about the attorney's office, the figure on the deed, $1,950. She thought about arithmetic. She ordered the click spring for Henry's clock. It arrived in 2 days. She installed it on a Thursday morning with her grandfather's tools, the loop pressed to her right eye, her hands steadier than she expected. When she wound the clock and set it going, and the chime struck the quarter hour in a clear, clean tone, she sat back on the stool and listened to it until it stopped. She called Henry Alcott. He came in that afternoon, and she showed him what she had found and what she had done, and he listened with the focused attention of a man who genuinely cared about the answer. When she was finished, he picked up the clock carefully, the way you carry something that belongs to someone who is no longer there to carry it themselves, and he stood with it for a moment. "What do I owe you?" he said. Rose thought about what her grandfather had said to him every year. For how many years she did not yet know. "A clock keeping good time," she said, "is payment enough." Henry looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. "That's what he used to say," he said. "I know," she said. He nodded. He picked up his clock and left. She stood behind the counter after he was gone and listened to the shop tick around her. Dozens of clocks, dozens of rhythms. None of them quite in time with each other, all of them running. She had not answered Patricia's voicemail yet. She had not answered the second one or the third. She knew what they contained. She had listened to the first one, 3 days in, standing in the back room with the composition book open in her hand. Patricia's voice had been careful, measured, the voice of someone who had decided to be reasonable and wanted credit for it. She had said that she was not trying to make things hard. She had said she understood Rose had feelings about the shop. She had said that a realistic appraisal of the situation would suggest that holding onto a non-viable business was not in Rose's long-term interest, and that there were developers in Corbin who had expressed interest in the main street corridor, and that a conversation couldn't hurt anything. Rose had closed the composition book. She had gone back to work. On Friday morning she opened the drawer of the workbench to look for a specific size of screwdriver, and found underneath the leather tool roll a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was a list in her grandfather's handwriting of every clock in the shop that needed winding, and how often, weekly, fortnightly, monthly, each one identified by its position on the wall or its place on a shelf, with a small hand-drawn diagram that showed where each clock was in relation to the window and the door. He had made her a map. She stood at the workbench with the paper in her hands. For a long time he had known. He had known he was not coming back. He had wound every clock before he left, and he had made a map so that whoever came after him would know how to keep them going. He had labeled every drawer and every cabinet for the same reason he always had. He had left the $47 in the register. He had left the composition book open on the counter with the pen clipped to the cover. He had left all of it for her. She did not know yet how she knew that. She just knew. And here is the thing I keep coming back to. He had made her a map for the clocks. A map that told her which ones needed winding, and how often and where each one was. He had thought about all of that. He had planned for it. What she had not found yet was the map for everything else. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Then she pulled out the center drawer of the workbench, the drawer she had opened a dozen times that week without thinking about it, and looked at it, at the wood of the bottom, at the way it sat in the frame, and she thought about something her grandfather had said to her once a long time ago when she was maybe 8 or 9, and had asked him how he always knew where to look when something was wrong with a clock. He had said, "You look where most people don't think to look." Not because the answer is hiding, because the answer is waiting. She pressed her fingers to the bottom of the drawer. The wood was solid, ordinary. She ran her fingers to the left corner. Nothing to the right corner. Nothing. Then she remembered, he always said. The middle first, then the sides. She pressed her fingers to the center of the drawer bottom. She felt it. A hairline seam. So fine she had run her fingers over it twice without registering it. A rectangle, perhaps 6 inches by 4. She pressed down. Nothing moved. She pressed harder, at the exact center. A soft click. And then the bottom of the drawer shifted. She did not open it right away. That was the thing she thought about afterward, when she tried to describe it to people who asked. She had found the seam, she had pressed the center, she had heard the click, and then she had stood there, with her fingers resting on the wood and not moved for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than a minute. The clocks ticked around her. She was aware of all of them, suddenly, in a way she had not been for the past several days. the grandfather clock against the far wall with its slow, deep pendulum beat, the small anniversary clock on the second shelf, its rotating balls catching the morning light, the cuckoo clock above the door that had not cuckooed since she arrived, though its hands were moving, because the cuckoo mechanism was a separate thing from the timekeeping, and her grandfather had apparently decided at some point that the cuckoo was not worth the effort of maintaining. She had learned that from the map. She pressed the panel again. It rose perhaps a quarter of an inch, hinged at the back. Not a hidden room, not a passage. A compartment built into the false bottom of the center drawer, deep enough to hold whatever he had put there, and narrow enough that you would not notice it unless you were looking, or unless you remembered that a certain old man had always said, "The middle first, then the sides." She lifted the panel fully. Inside was a key, not the key to the shop, different, older brass, the same worn color as the key she carried in her coat pocket, but longer with a more complex bit, the kind of key that opened something with actual tumblers rather than a simple pin lock. A tag was tied to it with a piece of cotton twine, the kind her grandfather had kept on a spool in the supply cabinet. On the tag, in his handwriting smaller than the composition book, more careful, the writing of a man trying to hold his hand still, were two words. Back wall. She stood at the workbench for a moment, with the key in her hand. Back wall. She looked at the back wall of the shop. She had looked at it 100 times in the past week. It was paneled in the same dark wood as the rest of the shop, floor to ceiling, the panels running vertically in sections about 2 feet wide. Her grandfather had hung a few things on it, a framed certificate from the American Watchmakers Clockmakers Institute, dated 1974, the glass slightly yellowed at the edges. A calendar from 1989 that he had apparently kept for reasons she did not know. A small wooden shelf at eye level holding 3 carriage clocks in various states of repair, their movements exposed, their cases open. She walked toward it. She ran her hand along the panels, left to right, starting from the corner nearest the utility sink and moving toward the center. The wood was smooth and cool. Old growth, she thought. The kind of wood they did not use for paneling anymore because there was none of it left. Her grandfather had installed this himself in the early years of the shop. She knew that because he had told her, once, that he had spent 2 weeks on it and had made every joint by hand. She pressed each panel as she moved along. The third panel from the left gave slightly under her hand. Not a click, not a latch, just a give, a softness as if the wood behind it were hollow. She stepped back and looked at it. It looked exactly like every other panel. The grain ran the same direction. The color was the same. The seams on either side were the same width as every other seam in the wall. But when she pressed it again, she felt it a faint flex, the response of something that was not solid behind it. She looked at the key in her hand. She looked at the panel. She ran her fingers along the right edge of it, down from the top, and at about shoulder height she found it. A small brass plate, perhaps an inch square, set flush with the surface of the wood, and painted over so many times that it was nearly invisible, unless you were looking at the right angle, in the right light. In the center of the plate was a keyhole. She looked at it for a moment. She pressed the key in. It fit. She turned it. A sound came from inside the wall, not a click, but a series of them, soft and sequential, like a mechanism releasing one stage at a time. She counted 3, then silence. Then the panel moved, not inward, sideways. It slid, smooth and almost soundless, on a track she had not known was there, disappearing behind the adjacent panel, and leaving an opening perhaps 18 inches wide and floor to ceiling tall. The air that came out was different, drier, cooler, the smell of cedar concentrated, as if the space had been packed with it, and underneath that, something she recognized without being able to immediately name, a faint, clean smell, mineral and still, the smell of metal that had been kept very still in a very dry place for a very long time. She stood at the opening. The space behind the wall was not a room. It was a cavity, perhaps 3 feet deep and 8 feet wide, running the width of the back wall between the shop's interior paneling and the exterior brick. Her grandfather had built it when he installed the paneling. She understood that now. He had pulled the paneling out from the brick and framed the space and put it all back together so that it looked like a wall, because that was what he wanted it to look like. She stood at the opening and let her eyes adjust. The light from the shop reached in perhaps a foot before it became dim. She went back to the supply cabinet and found a flashlight in the second drawer. labeled flashlight, with a spare battery taped to the side. She checked it. It worked. She went back to the opening. She shone the light inside. The clocks were arranged on shelves her grandfather had built into the back of the cavity, running floor to ceiling on both sides, leaving a narrow aisle down the center wide enough for one person to stand in. There were perhaps 40 of them, perhaps more. She did not count right away. She moved the flashlight slowly across each shelf, left to right, top to bottom. Bracket clocks in ebonized cases, their brass fittings dark with age. A Vienna regulator, its long pendulum hanging still in the dry air, its case the color of old honey. 2 carriage clocks with enamel panels on their doors, the enamel still vivid deep blue, the kind of blue that does not fade when it is kept in the dark. A skeleton clock under a glass dome, its movement fully exposed, every gear and spring visible, the whole thing so delicate it looked as if it had been assembled by someone working with a different, finer set of hands than the rest of us are given. She moved the light up. On the top shelf, running the full width of both sides, pocket watches, dozens of them. Some in cases, some loose. Some with chains still attached. The chains draped over the edge of the shelf in careful loops. Each one had a small tag tied to it with cotton twine. She reached for the nearest one, a gold hunter case, the surface worn to a soft mat at the edges where it had been opened and closed thousands of times. The tag said, Illinois Watch Co., 1909, 21 jewel. Running, she opened the case. The dial was white enamel with black Roman numerals, the numerals still sharp. A subsidiary seconds dial at the 6 o'clock position. She looked at the hands. They were still. She wound it gently 2 turns of the crown. Felt the mainspring catch. Set it down on her palm. It began to tick. She held it in the dark of the cavity with the flashlight in her other hand, and listened to it tick and was aware, in a way she had not been prepared for, of the sound of all the clocks outside the wall, ticking without her grandfather, running because he had wounded them before he left, keeping time for a room he was not in any more. She did not speak. There was no one to speak to. She stood in the opening of the wall her grandfather had built and let the smell of cedar and old metal settle around her, and did not move for what the clocks outside would have measured at approximately 4 minutes, though it did not feel like time at all. Then she turned the flashlight to the shelf nearest the opening on the left side, and she saw, on the lowest shelf, at eye level, a wooden box. Not a clock case. A box perhaps 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, made of walnut, with a brass clasp on the front and no lock. Her grandfather's initials were inlaid on the lid, in a lighter wood, maple perhaps. The inlay fitted so precisely that it lay flush with the surface. E.W. She looked at it. She did not open it. Not yet. She stood in the dim space with the pocket watch ticking in her hand and the box at eye level, and the clocks measuring the silence on the other side of the wall. And she understood, with a certainty she could not have explained to anyone, that whatever was in that box was the reason the wall had been built. Not the clocks, not the collection, the box. Everything else was the preparation. This was the thing she was supposed to find. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it out of the cavity and set it on the workbench under the lamp, and she stood there looking at it with both hands flat on the workbench on either side of it. And she did not open it, not yet, because she had learned something in the past week that she had not known she needed to learn. Some things are worth taking your time with. She put the key back in her pocket. She went to the front of the shop and turned the sign in the window to closed. She came back to the workbench. She sat down on the stool, then she opened the box. Inside, laid on a bed of dark green velvet, were 3 things. The first was a small leather notebook, its cover worn soft as cloth, the pages thick with her grandfather's handwriting. It was held closed with a length of the same cotton twine he used for everything, tied in a simple bow. The second was a folded document, official-looking, with a law firm's name printed at the top that she did not immediately recognize, Calloway and Marsh. Attorneys at law, Lexington, Kentucky, and a date that she had to look at twice, 1983. The third was a pocket watch, different from the ones on the shelves, not a collector's piece, smaller, plainer. A silver case, brushed rather than polished, with no engraving on the outside except along the very edge of the lid, where something had been scratched in by hand, not by a jeweler, not with a proper tool, but carefully, deliberately, the way her grandfather scratched his initials into a key. She turned it toward the lamp to read it. It took her a moment because the letters were small and the scratching was uneven in the way that hands are. Uneven when they are trying very hard to be steady. For Rose, she set the watch down on the velvet. She sat with both hands in her lap. The clocks ticked around her. The grandfather clock against the far wall. The anniversary clock on the second shelf, all of them ticking, running. Her grandfather had wound them before he left because he had known she was coming, and he had wanted them to be running when she arrived. And she had stood in this shop for a week, listening to them without understanding that they were, in the most literal sense, waiting for her. She picked up the pocket watch again. She pressed the crown. The lid opened. The dial was plain white, no subsidiary seconds, just the hours and minutes in simple Arabic numerals. The hands were stopped. The watch was not running. She wound it gently, the same 2 turns she had given the Illinois watch on the shelf, and set it on her palm. It did not start. She wound it once, more carefully, and waited. Nothing. She held it under the lamp and looked at the movement through the case back, which was plain glass, and she could see the mainspring, tensioned, and the gear train, and the balance wheel. The balance wheel was not moving. Something was holding it, something very small. She looked more closely. Wedged between the balance wheel and its cock, placed there deliberately and with great precision, was a folded slip of paper no larger than her thumbnail. Someone had stopped the watch on purpose, not because it was broken, because they had wanted it to stop. She picked up the finest of her grandfather's tweezers. She removed the paper. She unfolded it under the lamp. 2 lines in his handwriting. The hand was shakier than the notebook, shakier than the tag on the key, the handwriting of the very end of his life. But the letters were legible. He had taken care to make them legible. This one was always yours. I kept it running until I couldn't any more. Now it's your turn. She set the paper down. She picked up the watch. She held it level in her palm, the way he had taught her to hold a movement when you were checking its balance, flat and still, so the parts could find their own equilibrium. The balance wheel began to move, slowly at first, then with the quick, confident oscillation of a well-made thing that has simply been waiting for the right conditions to start again. The watch ticked in her hand. If you've made it this far into Rose's story, hit subscribe, because what I found in that notebook is the part I have been waiting to tell you. She did not look at the document yet. She did not open the notebook. She sat on the stool in the quiet of the shop with the watch ticking in her palm, and all the clocks measuring the morning around her. And she understood that she was holding something her grandfather had held, had wound, and listened to, and finally stopped and wrapped in velvet and left in a box in a wall, and that the act of starting it again was not a small thing. Then she set it carefully on the workbench, face up, and reached for the folded document. The document from Callaway and Marsh was 4 pages, stapled at the upper left corner, the paper heavy and cream-colored, kind of paper that law firms used when they wanted something to feel permanent. The date at the top was October 14th, 1983. She had been 7 years old in October of 1983. She remembered that year in the way you remember early childhood in images rather than sequences, bright and disconnected, a few things vivid and the rest gone. She remembered sitting on this stool. She remembered the smell of this shop. She turned to the first page. It was a trust document, an irrevocable trust established under Kentucky law, with Elwood James Whitmore listed as grantor and a Lexington bank listed as trustee. The trust had been funded at inception with an amount that made her stop reading and go back to the beginning of the sentence to make sure she had understood it correctly. $47,000 in 1983. She read the funding clause again. $47,000 transferred from a personal account at First Federal Savings of Corbin, Kentucky, representing the proceeds of the sale of a collection of antique timepieces conducted through a dealer in Louisville between March and September of that year. She set the first page down. She sat very still. He had sold a collection in 1983 and used the proceeds to fund a trust. She looked at the wall she had come in from, the cavity behind the paneling, the shelves she had seen by flashlight with their rows of bracket clocks and carriage clocks and Vienna regulators and pocket watches in the dark. She thought about what those clocks were worth. What they might be worth now, 40 years later, if he had been building the collection since 1983 instead of liquidating it. He had sold a collection to start the trust, and then he had started again. She turned to the second page. The trust terms were standard in their language, but not in their purpose. The principal was to be invested, and the returns used for a single designated purpose: the acquisition of antique and vintage timepieces of horological significance, to be held in trust and maintained in good working order, with the collection to pass in its entirety upon the grantor's death to the beneficiary named in Schedule A. She turned to Schedule A Rose Ellen Whitmore, her name, her full name, written in the formal language of a legal document in 1983, when she was 7 years old, and sitting on a stool in this shop, watching her grandfather work. She put the document down on the workbench. She looked at the wall. She thought about the clocks on those shelves. The bracket clocks, the Vienna regulator, the carriage clocks with their enamel panels, the skeleton clock under its glass dome, the pocket watches in their rows with their cotton twine tags. She thought about what a Vienna regulator in good condition was worth, what a collection of 40 or more antique timepieces, assembled over 40 years by a man who knew exactly what he was looking at, might be worth. She picked up the document again and turned to the final page. At the bottom, below the signature lines and the notary's seal, there was a handwritten note in the margin, not part of the official document, added later, in ink that was slightly different from the rest, the handwriting older and more careful. Collection appraised November 2022. Total value per Harmon and Associates, Louisville, $287,000. She read it again. $287,000. She set the document down a second time and did not pick it up again for a while. The grandfather clock against the far wall struck the half hour, a single resonant note that moved through the shop and faded. Then the other clocks, the ones with chimes and the ones with bells and the one near the window with a small ship's bell mounted on its case, each of them marking the same moment in their own voice, overlapping, a brief chorus and then silence, and then just the ticking again. She did not open the notebook immediately. She went to the back room and ran cold water from the tap, and stood at the utility sink with her wrists under it for a moment, the way she did sometimes when she needed to think clearly. The pipe Curtis Reeve had fixed 2 days ago held without dripping. She noticed that. She noticed small things now in this shop. She had not been a person who noticed small things particularly before this week. She dried her hands on the towel hanging from the cabinet door. She went back to the workbench. She untied the cotton twine from the notebook. The cover was leather, dark brown, softened with age, and handling to the texture of something almost living. There was no title on the cover, no dates, just the leather, and on the inside of the front cover, in the ink her grandfather used for everything, a medium blue. From a fountain pen she had watched him refill dozens of times a single line. For the record, she turned to the first page. The notebook was not a diary. It was not a journal in any conventional sense. It was a ledger. Every page was the same: a name, a date, a description, and a note in the right margin. The entries were chronological. The first one was dated February 3, 1981. 3 weeks after the shop opened. Marvella Coates, 78. Sessions mantel clock, rear strike train worn, repaired. No charge fixed income, husband recently passed. Note, brought a piece of pie, left it on the counter. She turned the page. March 17th, 1981. Harold Sizemore, 84. Belgian pocket watch, mainspring replaced. No charge, cannot see well enough to wind it himself. Note, very proud man, did not want to accept. Told him the parts cost $3. He paid $3. She turned another page. April, May, June, each page the same format. A name, an age, a repair, a note. No charge. She mentioned she hadn't slept well in months since her clock stopped, and the silence kept her awake. No charge. He walked 4 miles to bring it in. Said it was his wife's. She passed last winter. No charge, 91 years old, lives alone. Told me his granddaughter used to wind it for him before she moved to Cincinnati. She turned pages. The handwriting stayed consistent through the 1980s, precise, upright. The handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship by someone who took it seriously. In the 1990s, it loosened slightly. In the early 2000s, it became the handwriting she recognized from the composition book on the counter. By the 2010s, the letters were larger, the lines less even, the hand working harder to produce the same result. But the entries never stopped. She counted as she went. Not every entry was no charge. There were paying customers interspersed throughout. Their repairs noted with amounts paid. The money presumably what kept the business running well enough to sustain everything else. But the no-charge entries came regularly, sometimes twice in a week, sometimes 4 or 5 times in a month, always with the same notation. Elderly, alone, fixed income, recently widowed, cannot manage the mechanism anymore. She was somewhere in 1997 when she found her own name for the first time. The entry was dated September 9, 1997. She would have been 21. Just started her alterations apprenticeship in Lexington. Rose called today, working hard. Sounds tired, good tired. Adjusted the Seth Thomas shelf clock she took with her. She mentioned it had been running fast. Told her to bring it back when she was home for Christmas. She read it again. She turned the page. March 2001. Rose came for the weekend. Brought her sewing machine. The motor was making a sound she didn't like. Fixed it in an hour. Told her the motor was fine, just needed cleaning. Didn't charge her. She tried to argue. Told her that was what grandfathers were for. She pressed her fist against her mouth. She looked at the workbench, at the pocket watch ticking next to the walnut box, at the document with her name on Schedule A, at the notebook open in front of her. She turned pages slowly now. The entries about her were sparse once or twice a year, sometimes less. A visit noted, a clock she had brought home, a phone call, but they were there every year, woven into the ledger of all the other names, all the other repairs, all the other old people who had walked into this shop or sent someone on their behalf because they needed to know what time it was and could not afford to fix the thing that told them. She found the final entry dated about her on a Tuesday in March, 4 years before he went to Meadowbrook. Rose asked me today why I kept the shop when I could have retired years ago. Told her I wasn't ready to stop yet. She accepted that. She is good at accepting things she cannot immediately change. She gets that from her grandmother. What I didn't tell her, I keep the shop because of the names in this book. Every one of them needed something I could give. That is not a small thing. That is not something you retire from. She set the notebook down. She sat on the stool for a long time. Outside on Main Street, a car went past, then another. The hardware store next door opened. She heard Dale's key in his lock. Heard him pull up the security grate. Heard the muffled sound of his radio starting. The cuckoo clock above the door, which had not cuckooed once since she arrived, chose this moment to attempt it. The door opened, the mechanism ground. The cuckoo emerged perhaps a quarter-inch and stopped, and the door closed again. She almost laughed. She picked up the notebook again and turned to the last pages. The entries grew shorter as the handwriting grew harder to produce. The final dated entry was November 18th, 2022, 2 months before he went to Meadowbrook. Agnes Holbrook, 91, anniversary clock, suspension spring broken, repaired, no charge. 91 years old and still wants to know what time it is. Good for her. Below it, in the last few lines of the last page, with no date in the largest and most careful letters in the entire book. 312 names. 41 years. If a clock is running, it still has work to do. She closed the notebook. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she put it down and picked up the folded document one more time, not to reread it, just to hold it. She turned it over in her hands the way her grandfather had turned things, watches, movements, cases, to look at all of them from every angle before deciding what needed to be done. She sat on the stool for a long time. She thought about a question she had asked him once, a Tuesday afternoon, maybe 7 years ago, sitting in the back room of the care facility with the window open and the sound of a lawnmower somewhere outside. She had asked him why he had never shown her the shop's back room. He had looked at her over the top of his glasses, that same look, the one she had been seeing since she was 6 years old, and said, "I was waiting until you were ready to understand what it was for." She had thought he meant the tools, the storage, the utilities. She understood now that the question he had been answering was a different one, entirely. He had not been waiting for her to be ready for the room. He had been waiting for her to be ready for the reason the room existed. 312 names, 41 years. The reason was the same reason for all of it: the tree, the map, the trust document in 1983, her name on Schedule A when she was 7 years old. He had not been building a collection. He had not been running a shop. He had been writing a letter, one repaired clock at a time, for 40 years, addressed to someone who could not read it yet. She was reading it now. She thought about Patricia. Patricia had called 5 times, had left 4 voicemails, each one slightly more reasonable in tone than the last. which meant each one slightly more insistent than the one before. Rose had listened to all of them now. In the most recent one, Patricia had mentioned a developer named Stephen Garrity who had purchased 3 properties on the Main Street corridor in the past 18 months, and who had expressed specific interest in the clock shop building. She had said the number Garrity had mentioned, she called it a starting point, was considerably more than the appraised value of the building, and its contents. She had not mentioned $287,000 because she did not know about it. Rose thought about that. She thought about 1983, about her grandfather sitting in this shop at the age of 48, having just sold a collection he had spent years building, transferring $47,000 into a trust, starting over. She thought about what it meant to make a decision that large, that quietly, for someone who was 7 years old, and did not yet know she would need it. She thought about Patricia saying, "Grandpa always had a soft spot for you. I guess that's what this is." She thought about what that phrase assumed. That generosity was sentiment. That what her grandfather had built over 41 years in a clock shop on Main Street in Corbin, Kentucky, was simply a matter of affection. A soft spot. She looked at the notebook, 312 names. She looked at the document, $287,000. She looked at the pocket watch. This one was always yours. Patricia had not sat on the stool. Patricia had not answered the door at Meadowbrook every Sunday for 3 years. Patricia had not listened to the names, had not learned the location of the spare fuses, had not been told by a 70-year-old man named Henry Alcott that her grandfather had refused. Payment every year for a decade because a clock keeping good time was payment enough. Patricia had made her choice. She had made it over years, in the way you make most choices, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones, each of them ordinary, each of them accumulating into something you could not easily undo. Her grandfather had made his choice the same way. Rose had made hers too, she realized, sitting on the stool in the shop that smelled of cedar and machine oil, and 40 years of her grandfather, holding a pocket watch he had stopped and wrapped in velvet and left for her to start again. She had made it every Sunday for 3 years. She had made it the first morning she came in and swept the floor. She had made it when she took Henry Alcott's clock apart and found the worn click spring and ordered the part and installed it with her grandfather's tools. She set the watch face up on the workbench and watched it tick. She had one more thing to look at. She had known, from the moment she opened the box, that the pocket watch was the last thing. The document first, because it established the facts, the notebook second, because it explained the reason for the facts, and the watch last, because it was not information. It was something else. She turned it over in her hand and looked at the case back. There was an engraving she had not seen before on the inner surface of the case back, hidden when the watch was closed. Small, precise, done by a professional, not scratched by hand. She held it under the lamp to my granddaughter Rose, who always knew which thread to pull to make a thing hold together. She closed the case. She set the watch down. Raymond, Patricia's husband, who handled their finances and had accompanied her to the attorney's office, had said something in the parking lot afterward that she had not responded to at the time. He had said, "It's just a clock shop, Rose. Nobody fixes watches anymore." He had said it without malice. He had simply meant it. She thought about 312 names. She thought about 91-year-old Agnes Holbrook, who still wanted to know what time it was. She thought about the word just. Patricia called again at 4:17 p.m., while Rose was in the cavity behind the back wall with a flashlight, making a proper inventory of the collection. She let it go to voicemail. She was in the middle of counting the pocket watches on the upper left shelf, and she had reached 31 and did not want to lose her place. She would call Patricia back. She would tell her about the trust, about the collection, about the document with Rose Ellen Whitmore on Schedule A. She would tell her all of it, calmly, because there was no reason not to be calm. The document was 40 years old. It was irrevocable. It had been established by a man who had understood, in 1983, that clarity was a form of kindness, that leaving things uncertain was its own kind of unkindness, and that the people you loved deserved to know, as precisely as possible, what you had intended. Patricia would be quiet for a long time. She would not apologize. Rose did not expect her to. What Patricia believed that she had contributed more, that she was owed more, That the soft spot had been an injustice was not something a phone call was going to resolve. Rose understood that. She had spent 31 years as a seamstress. She knew that some tears ran along the grain and some ran against it, and that the ones that ran against it required a different approach. She finished counting the pocket watches, 38. She wrote the number in the composition book. Then she went back out into the shop, slid the panel closed, turned the key, and stood for a moment in front of the sealed wall with her hand flat against the wood, feeling the coolness of it, the solidity of what her grandfather had built there. She took her hand away. She went to put the kettle on. Dale, from the hardware store, knocked on the front door at 4:45 p.m., just as the kettle was finishing. He had a box under his arm and an expression that suggested he had been working up to something. She let him in. "Brought you something," he said. He set the box on the counter. Inside, wrapped in newspaper, were 6 boxes of clock hand lubricant, a set of mainspring winders in 4 sizes, and a box of assorted click springs. She looked at him. "Had them in the back," he said. "Been there since my father's time. No use to me." He paused. "Figured they might be use to you." She thought about what to say. She said, "Thank you, Dale." He nodded. He looked around the shop the way he always did when he came in. The slow look of someone cataloging what was the same and what had changed. "You going to open back up?" It was the question everyone asked. "Yes," she said. It was the first time she had said it without qualification. Without "I think," or "I'm not sure yet," or "I'm still figuring it out." Dale nodded again, as if this were not news but confirmation. "Good," he said. "Place has been too quiet." He left. She stood at the counter with the box of supplies and thought about what it meant to say yes to something you had been circling for a week. Not that the decision had been made in that moment. The decision had been accumulating the same way. Everything in this shop had accumulated slowly, carefully, over time, one piece placed next to another until the shape of it became clear. She poured her tea and took it to the workbench. She sat for a while looking at the walnut box, the document, the notebook, the pocket watch, the 4 things her grandfather had left for her, in the order he had intended her to find them. She thought about the trust document. $287,000. She thought about what that number meant in practical terms, not as an abstraction, not as a figure on a page, but as a material reality. It meant the collection could be held. It meant the shop could be maintained. It meant she did not have to choose between keeping her grandfather's work alive and keeping her own life solvent. He had understood in 1983 that she would need both. She was not sure that was a soft spot. She was not sure what to call it. She thought about the name Patricia had used in her voicemail. Stephen Garrity, the developer. She thought about what the building on Main Street, between a hardware store and a vacant tax office, would look like as part of a corridor of condos. She thought about what it would mean for Agnes Holbrook to need her anniversary clock repaired, and to discover that the shop where it had always been repaired was now a building with a different name on it, and that there was no one in the county, or possibly in this part of the state, who would touch it. She thought about 91 years old, still wanting to know what time it was. She picked up the composition book and opened it to the current page, the one with her own handwriting filling the lines below her grandfather's. She added an entry. November 8th. Full inventory of collection complete. 41 pieces, bracket and mantel clocks. 38 pocket watches. 3 carriage clocks, enamel panels intact. 1 Vienna regulator, pendulum still. 1 skeleton clock under dome complete. Total appraised value per Harmon and Associates, 2022. $287,000. She put the pen down. She would call Calloway and Marsh in Lexington on Monday morning. She would speak to whoever had drafted the trust document in 1983, or whoever had inherited the file, and she would begin to understand the mechanics of what she had inherited and what it required of her. She would call Henry Alcott and tell him what she had found, because he had known her grandfather for 40 years and deserved to know, and because she thought he might not be entirely surprised. She would not call Patricia tonight. She would call her tomorrow, in the morning, when she was rested and the light was good, and she had her grandfather's notebook in front of her, and the watch in her pocket, and the shop around her, ticking. She stood up from the stool. She put on her coat. She put the pocket watch in her coat pocket, where the key to the shop had been all week, and she felt them settle together, the key and the watch, the practical and the given, the thing that opened the door, and the thing that told you what time it was. She turned off the lamp over the workbench. She stood in the dark for a moment, listening. The clocks ticked around her, all of them. The grandfather clock, the anniversary clock, the cuckoo clock above the door that could not quite manage its own cuckoo. Dozens of mechanisms in dozens of cases, each one keeping its own time. None of them quite synchronized, all of them running. She went to the door. She turned the sign to closed. She stepped out onto Main Street and locked the door behind her and stood for a moment on the sidewalk with her hand still on the key. The street was quiet. The hardware store was dark. Across the way, the diner was still lit, and she could see a couple at the window table, talking, and the waitress, moving between the counter and the kitchen. She took her hand off the key. She walked to her car. She called Calloway and Marsh on Monday morning at 8:51 a.m. and spoke to a woman named Sandra, who had been with the firm for 22 years and who knew the Whitmore file without having to look it up. Sandra told her that the trust had been maintained in good standing since 1983, that the corpus had grown through conservative investment to just under $340,000 inclusive of the collections, appraised value, and that the transfer of the collection to Rose as sole beneficiary was straightforward and could be completed within 30 days, pending standard documentation. Sandra also told her, before she hung up, that Elwood Whitmore had called the firm every year in November to confirm the trust was in order. 41 years of November phone calls. Rose wrote that down in the composition book. Then she called Henry Alcott. He arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing his canvas jacket, and she told him everything. She set the walnut box on the counter and showed him the document, and the notebook, and the pocket watch, and the engraving on the case back, and she watched his face while she talked. He did not interrupt. He listened the way her grandfather had listened fully, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He picked up the leather notebook. He turned to the first page. He read the first entry. He turned a few more pages, reading slowly. Then he set it down and looked at the wall at the back of the shop. I knew he had something back there, Henry said. She looked at him. Not what, he said, just the way he moved around that wall, always careful, like it was different from the other walls. He paused. A man who works with mechanisms his whole life, he moves differently around things that matter. You notice after 40 years. She thought about that. Did he ever say anything to you? She said. Once, Henry said. About 6, 7 years ago. I asked him what he was going to do with the shop when he couldn't work anymore. He said he already knew what was going to happen to it. Said it the way you say something that's been decided for a long time. Henry looked at the notebook. I thought he meant he was going to sell it. He did sell it, Rose said. To me, for $1. Henry looked at her. It's in the trust document, she said. Schedule C. Transfer of real property to beneficiary upon grantor's death. Consideration $1 to be paid from the trust corpus. Henry was quiet for a moment, then he said, That sounds like Elwood. She opened the shop the following Tuesday. She did not advertise. She turned the sign from closed to open at 7:30 a.m., unlocked the door, and went back to the workbench where she was in the middle of cleaning the movement of a French mantel clock she had taken from the collection, a piece she had identified from her grandfather's inventory notes as needing service before it could be displayed. The first customer came in at 8:17 a.m. She was 83 years old, and her name was Pauline Drury, and she had a battery-operated wall clock in a paper bag that had stopped working 3 months ago. She set it on the counter and explained, in careful detail, that it had belonged to her late husband, and that she had tried 2 new batteries without result, and that she was not sure what else to do. Rose looked at it. The battery contacts were corroded badly, the kind of corrosion that came from a battery left too long in a damp room. A 10-minute job, she cleaned the contacts. She put in a new battery. She set the clock running and handed it back. Pauline Drury held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment. What do I owe you? She said. Rose thought about 312 names in a leather notebook. Nothing, she said. Come back if it gives you any more trouble. Pauline Drury looked at her over the clock. You're Elwood's granddaughter, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Rose said. Pauline Drury nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed that she had already suspected. He fixed this clock for me 6 years ago, she said. Wouldn't take anything then either. She paused. I always thought I'd find a way to repay him. Never did figure out how. She left with the clock running under her arm. By the end of the first week, Rose had taken in 11 jobs. 4 of them she charged for standard repairs, working mechanisms, nothing complicated. 7 she did not. The 7 were all the same. Elderly, alone, a clock that had belonged to someone no longer there. A person who needed to know what time it was and had no one to ask. She added them to the composition book, not in her grandfather's format, in her own. A name, a date, a description, a note. She ordered a new leather notebook from the stationery shop on the next block. Henry Alcott came in every Thursday morning. He did not always bring a clock. Sometimes he brought coffee, 2 cups from the diner across the street, and sat on the stool behind the counter and talked while Rose worked. He told her things about her grandfather. She had not known the kind of things that filled in the shape of a person. That he had learned watchmaking from a man in Knoxville, who had learned it from a man in Switzerland, and that he had considered this lineage something worth maintaining. That he had kept a running account in a small ledger of every clock he had repaired for free, not the composition book. A different one, older, that Henry had seen once and never mentioned until now. Rose wrote all of it in the new notebook. She called Patricia on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after she had found the box. She had thought about what to say. She had decided in the end to say all of it, the trust, the collection, the document, the notebook, the 312 names, and to say it without pausing, without softening, without leaving room for Patricia to insert herself until Rose was finished. She was finished in 11 minutes. Patricia was quiet for what the clock on the kitchen wall would have measured as 43 seconds. Rose did not look at the clock. She looked at the window. Outside, the maple at the back of the yard had gone bare in the last week, the last of the red leaves down, the branches clean and dark against the gray November sky. He never told me, Patricia said. No, Rose said. A pause then, he could have told me. Rose thought about the November phone calls to Calloway and Marsh. 41 of them. Every year the same call, confirming the trust was in order. A man who planned for 41 years and made sure everything was in place, that man, had made a decision about what to tell Patricia and what to leave alone. He told you what he thought you needed to know, Rose said. He told me the same. Patricia was quiet again. Longer this time. Rose let the quiet be what it was. She had spent 31 years working with fabric, and she knew that some materials, when you pulled on them, pulled back. You could not force them. You waited for them to find their shape. I stayed, Patricia said finally. It was not an accusation. It was not an argument. It was the plainest thing she had said in the entire conversation, and the weight of it was different from everything before it. 3 decades in 2 words. The 11 months of chemotherapy. The Sundays she had not had because someone had to be there. The Nashville job she had not taken in 1994 because their mother had her first episode that fall, and Patricia had been the one who answered the phone. I know, Rose said. I just. Patricia stopped. Started again. I thought that's what it meant. Staying. Rose did not answer right away. She looked at the bare maple. She thought about a man who planted a tree for someone he loved before they were old enough to sit under it. She thought about the fact that he had never told her about the tree, either not directly, not as a gift or a gesture, just mentioned it once in passing the way he mentioned most things. It did mean something, Rose said. It always did. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm not going to fight it. I want you to know that. I know, Rose said. I didn't think you would. That was not quite true. But it was what the moment required, and some moments require you to be slightly more generous than what is strictly accurate. They spoke for another 10 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the shop, about Gary's property in Harlan County, about their mother's friend who had moved into assisted living, about a cousin's daughter getting married in the spring. Ordinary things. The kind of things you say when you are trying to find your way back to ordinary, and not quite there yet, but moving in the right direction. When they hung up, Rose sat at the kitchen table with the phone in front of her. She did not know what Patricia would do with it, with the knowing. With the stayed, some things, once said, settled into a new shape and held. Some kept shifting. She had spent 31 years working with fabric, and she understood that what a material did, under tension, depended entirely on how it had been made, and that you could not always predict it until you applied the pressure and watched. She would wait and see. She had learned in the past 3 weeks that some things were worth taking your time with. She went back to the shop. Henry Alcott organized the community dinner. He did not call it that. He called it a thank you, which was more accurate, but also more modest than what it turned out to be. He reserved the back room at the diner across the street for a Saturday evening in the first week of December and told Rose it was for a few people who had wanted to say something, and when she arrived there were 43 people in the room and a long table with food that various people had, brought from their own kitchens, and a noise that hit her when she opened the door like something physical, warm, and immediate, the noise of a room full of people who were glad to be in the same place at the same time. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Henry appeared at her elbow. "I may have underestimated the response," he said. She sat at the head of the table because Henry put her there and she did not argue. And she ate and listened and was spoken to by people she had met in the past 2 months, and people she had not seen since childhood, and people she was certain she had never met at all, each of them with some version of the same thing to say. Marvella Coates' daughter, 71 years old, who said, "My mother talked about your grandfather until the day she died. She said he was the only person in town who never made her feel like a burden." A man named Curtis Webb, who said he had been one of the 7 children in a family that had never had much, and that Elwood Whitmore had quietly paid the electricity bill for their house 3 winters running in the 1980s, a fact his mother had not told anyone until she was on her deathbed. Pauline Drury, who came with her clock in the paper bag and set it on the table in front of Rose and said, "I thought I'd never figure out how to repay him. I think maybe this is close enough." An elderly man named Walter Foss, who had brought his wife's anniversary clock in a box under his arm, who sat down next to Rose and told her that his wife had died in March, and that the clock had stopped the same day, and that he had not been able to bring himself to fix it because it felt like something that should not be forced, and that coming here tonight felt like the first thing that had felt right in 8 months. Rose looked at the clock in its box. She said, "Bring it into the shop on Monday. We'll look at it together." He nodded. He did not speak again for a while, but he stayed at the table, and after a time she noticed that he was talking to Darlene Puckett about a trip he had taken with his wife to the Smoky Mountains 20 years ago, and that he was smiling in the careful way of someone who is finding that the memory does not hurt quite as much as they expected when they let themselves look at it directly. She did not stay until the end. She left at 9 o'clock p.m., after the food was mostly gone and the room had reached the comfortable lower volume of people settling into longer conversations, and she walked across the street to the shop and let herself in and stood in the dark with the door closed behind her. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The key was there. The watch was there. She took the watch out and held it in her palm in the dark, the way she had stood in the cavity behind the back wall on the day she found it and felt it tick. She thought about 41 years. She thought about 312 names. She thought about a man who had planted a tree the year she was born, so that she would have something to sit under when she was old enough to want the shade. She put the watch back in her pocket. She reopened the shop officially on the second Tuesday of January. She had a new sign made the same lettering as the old one, the same colors, but with all the letters whole and level, and below the original name, in smaller letters, Est. 1981. Elwood J. Whitmore. Continued 2024. She had not been sure about the continued. Darlene had said it was right. Henry had said it was right. She had thought about it for 3 days, and concluded they were correct. The morning she hung the sign, Henry came to watch. He stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket pockets, while she and Dale from the hardware store used a ladder and a level, and a considerable amount of discussion about whether it was plumb. When it was done, Henry stood looking at it for a long time. "He would have liked that," he said. "I know," she said. She went inside and turned the sign in the window to open. She went to the workbench. She unrolled the leather tool roll, his tool roll, the one he had owned since before her mother was born, each tool in its own place, smallest to largest, left to right, the same order he had kept them for 41 years. She picked up the loop, his loop, the one with the small crack in the barrel that he had wrapped with electrical tape sometime in the 1990s, and never replaced because it still worked, and pressed it to her right eye. She picked up the pocket watch from the corner of the workbench where she had left it the night before, ticking, and set it in front of her under the lamp. She went to work. A clockmaker understands time differently than the rest of us. He knows it cannot be saved. It can only be given. Elwood Whitmore gave his one repaired watch at a time for 40 years. What Rose Whitmore understood, standing in a shop full of running clocks on a January morning, was that her grandfather had not left her a business. He had left her a practice. The practice of paying attention to what was worn and what was broken, and what only needed someone to know how much pressure to apply, and where, and when. That is not something you inherit. That is something you choose every morning when you pick up the tools and begin. If this story stayed with you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for a new story every week, and leave a comment. Is there someone in your life who gave quietly for years and never asked to be seen for it?